The Anglo-Saxons were very important in the development of the English language. The Anglo-Saxons helped create a new language. Their West Germanic languages are considered the foundation of the present-day English. All of this begins with the influence the Angles and the Saxons had on Britain.
The language spoken by the Anglo-Saxons were part of a larger group known as the Indo-European language family. The Anglo-Saxons had once spoken different West Germanic dialects, but over time they began to speak English, which is also known as Old English, Anglo-Saxon, and sometimes even Anglo-Frisian, which is exactly where this language lies on the family tree. Old English was also closely related to Old Frisian and Old Saxon, as they emerged from the same branch, the branch of West Germanic languages. Eventually, Old English would lead to present-day English, even though it differed greatly from the English we speak today.
Old English had many characteristics that are very different from modern-day English. Latin had a large influence on Old English, especially because of the Church. Danish also contributed many vocabulary words. The different parts of speech in Old English had different characteristics than they do now in modern English. In nouns, the biggest difference is that they had declensions, which meant that the number and gender were identified. Verbs also had declensions. There were two main tenses of verbs that were used in Old English. They were present, future, and past tense. There were also two classes of verb stems. The first was vocalic, in which an internal vowel shows variations, which was also known as strong verbs, and the other was consonantal, which is also known as weak verbs. Adjectives were another part of speech that had some differences in Old English. They could either have weak or strong declensions depending on whether they had a determiner before them. They had to agree in case, gender, and number with the nouns. When adjectives had the endings lik or e added to them, they became adverbs. Old English did not have articles. Also, the syntax in Old English was much more flexible than it is now. The word order was not as important because the declensions told the function of the word in the sentence. However, the general word order was still subject, verb, object. But when the stress began to move to the beginning of the word, the endings were not pronounced as clearly, and as a result, the endings began to disappear completely. So now in modern English, the word order is important because we don't have declensions. There are several other ways in which modern English has become different from Old English.
Why is modern English so different from Old English? Modern English is essentially an evolved version of Old English that over hundreds of years was influenced by other languages. In the transition to Middle English, Britain underwent two major invasions, the Scandinavian and the Norman. The Normans, or French, had a huge influence and introduced thousands of words and of new vocabulary words into the English language. When Britain came to power, they were influenced by vocabulary words for objects they had not seen before, like the kangaroo. We can see the difference between Old English and modern English words. For example, in Old English, the word swin means pork in modern English. But even though these two languages are quite different, they're both still considered modern English and the words that we use most often are usually from Anglo-Saxon. But even though we see many differences between Old English and modern English, the words that are used most often today are usually rooted from Old English.
When the Anglo-Saxons first migrated from Britain, their language was more or less uniform. It was not until later that Old English developed its four major dialects, collectively known as English. Natural and political boundaries influenced the spread and interaction of these dialects. The Jutes, for example, inhabited the southwestern region of Kent, which is where they developed an Old English dialect called Kentish. West Saxon took over the rest of South England where the Saxons claimed territory. The Angles took over much of central England and are a special case in that they have the Humber River dividing their region. As a result of the separation, two speech groups, Northumbrian and Southumbrian, or Mercian, developed in the Anglian-speaking region. As a result of the separation, two speech groups, Northumbrian and Southumbrian, or Mercian, developed in the Anglian-speaking region. As a result of the separation, two speech groups, Northumbrian and Southumbrian, or Mercian, developed in the Anglian-speaking region. In the 8th century, the Northumbrian speech group led in literature and culture. That leadership shifted to Wessex and the West Saxon dialect in the 9th century when Viking invaders entered England. Winchester became the chief center of learning, and, under the reign of King Alfred, West Saxon became the standard Old English dialect. This was solely due to historical context. With King Alfred and Wessex as the political and cultural powerhouse of England, West Saxon was a dialect that the higher and educated class spoke. Naturally, it became the most influential dialect among the Anglo-Saxons. The English language has been influenced, invaded, and changed completely since the Angles and Saxons first formed it. But thanks to them, we have a beautifully rich vocabulary and an amazing language.